You know, there's a number that touches the lives of millions of Canadians. It's a number that shapes paychecks, that businesses stress over, and that workers, well, they really depend on it. We are, of course, talking about the minimum wage, and it is right at the heart of one of the biggest, most passionate debates in our economy. So let's dive in and see what the data actually tells us.
And this really is the core question, isn't it? On the surface, it seems so simple. Pay people more money, and they'll be better off. But as we're about to see, the reality is, well, it's a lot messier. This is a real tug-of-war, with powerful arguments and some pretty surprising data on all sides.
Okay, so first, let's just get the lay of the land. This is what the minimum wage landscape looks like across Canada as we head into 2026. And the first thing that jumps out is, wow, there is no single number. I mean, depending on where you live, you could be making $15 an hour in Alberta or nearly $20 in Nunavut. So think of this less as a list of numbers and more like a map of different economic experiments all running at the same time, all affecting real people from coast to coast to coast.
So, with all these different rates, why is there this constant push to raise them even higher? Let's start with the argument for a higher minimum wage, which really all boils down to one powerful idea: fairness.
First things first, we've got to bust a pretty common myth. You know, the idea that minimum wage jobs are just for teenagers earning some pocket money while living at home. Well, the data paints a very different picture. Sure, about half of minimum wage earners are under 25, but that means the other half are adults. And when you look at federally regulated jobs, it's even clearer. The majority of these workers are adults in their prime working years, between 25 and 54.
So for proponents like the Canadian Labour Congress, this is really an issue of social justice. They point out that low-wage work hits women harder. About 22% of women earn less than $15 an hour, compared to just 14% of men. But the argument is bigger than that. They talk about a ripple effect. See, when you raise the wage floor, employers often have to bump up the pay for people earning just above the new minimum too. So it lifts more people up. And this quote, it just perfectly captures the spirit of the whole movement. For advocates, this isn't just about spreadsheets and economics, it's a moral argument. It's about making sure that if someone works a full-time job, they can actually earn a decent living.
But of course, that push for fairness creates pressure somewhere else. So now, let's flip the coin and look at this from the perspective of a small business owner. For them, a mandated wage hike isn't just an idea on paper. It's a very real cost they have to figure out how to cover.
And those concerns are, well, they're pretty much everywhere. Get this, a staggering 83% of small business owners are worried about the financial hit from big, sudden jumps in the minimum wage. We're not talking about a small fringe group here. This is a mainstream feeling across the entire business community.
So what exactly are they worried about? Well, the biggest fear is having to raise prices and feeding into inflation. In fact, 6 out of 10 businesses say they've already had to do exactly that to cover higher wage bills. And then you get into the really tough choices, like cutting staff hours, putting a freeze on new hiring, or even having to let people go. Many are calling for more predictable, smaller increases tied to things like inflation, or for the government to use other tools like tax credits to help workers without putting the whole burden on the employer.
Okay, so we've heard the arguments, but what happens when we step back from the debate and just look at what economists have found when they crunch the numbers? Well, this is where things get really interesting, because the data reveals some powerful and sometimes pretty unexpected consequences.
Let's look at a big study from the University of Waterloo. Researchers dug into decades of Canadian data to see what actually happened to families when the minimum wage went up. And what they found really throws a wrench in that simple story of raise wages and you reduce poverty.
And here it is, the central, kind of paradoxical finding from their work. The whole goal, of course, is to reduce poverty. But this study found that a 10% increase in the minimum wage was actually linked to a 4 to 6% increase in the number of families living below the poverty line. So wait, a policy designed to help might actually be hurting? What is going on here?
It all comes down to teen employment. See, that same 10% wage hike was also linked to a 3 to 5% drop in jobs for teenagers. Why teens? Well, they tend to have the least experience, so when entry-level jobs get more expensive for a business, they're often the first ones who don't get hired. Now, for a middle-class family, a teenager losing their part-time job is a bummer, but for a low-income family, that paycheck can be absolutely vital. Losing it can be the shock that pushes the entire family's finances over the edge.
And these effects aren't just at the family level, they ripple out across the entire economy. So the Bank of Canada stepped back and took a look at the big picture national impact of all these planned wage hikes.
And what they found were some pretty clear trade-offs. On a national scale, their models suggested that these wage hikes would lead to about 60,000 fewer jobs overall. They also act as a bit of a brake on the economy, slowing down GDP growth by about 0.1% and at the same time nudging up inflation by a similar amount. So while a lot of workers get a raise, the data suggests there are these real, tangible costs to the economy as a whole.
So, with all this talk about economic effects and trade-offs, there's another really fundamental question we have to ask. How does the legal minimum wage stack up against what it actually costs an everyday Canadian to live, especially in our biggest cities?
This brings us crashing right back down to reality. A living wage isn't about luxury. It's the hourly rate someone needs to earn just to cover the basics. We're talking food, rent, transportation. And as you can see, in Canada's big cities, the legal minimum wage isn't even in the same ballpark. Look at Toronto. The gap is almost $10 an hour. And it's the same story in Vancouver and Ottawa. There's this huge disconnect between what the law says you have to be paid and what you actually need to survive.
Let's make that gap real for a second. In Toronto, that $9.60 difference means a person working full-time on minimum wage is falling short of a living wage by over $336 every single week. That's not a gap, that's a chasm, and it represents this incredible financial pressure that thousands and thousands of Canadians are living with every single day.
And this reality gap, it doesn't affect everyone equally. The data from Toronto is really clear on this. While over 17% of all workers are earning less than a living wage, that number jumps way up for specific groups. More than 20% of racialized workers and more than 20% of women are in this situation. And for racialized women, who are at the intersection of those two groups, the situation is the toughest. Nearly 1 in 4 earns less than a living wage. They are the most likely to be falling through this gap.
So, where does all of this leave us? It seems the minimum wage is a really powerful policy, but it's also a blunt tool. On the one hand, it's an absolute lifeline, giving a vital pay raise to many. But on the other, the data shows there are real trade-offs, potential job losses, higher prices, that can sometimes end up hurting the very people it's supposed to help. Which brings us right back to our big question. In this complicated fight for a decent quality of life, is the minimum wage the right tool for the job, or is it just one small piece of a much, much bigger puzzle?